Hi everyone, good morning. Welcome to the 84th Learn with Lorna, where we'll be looking at witchcraft. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. As I say, it's the 84th in the series, which seems quite extraordinary, so do let me know if you've been with me for all 84. For those of you who have not been with us for all 84 and are just joining, welcome. This is a series which I present. My name's Lorna. I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service, and the purpose of the series is to share the extraordinary things that we hold in our collections with you. The Highland Archive Service, for those who don't know, has 4 archive centres. We have the Highland Archive and Registration Centre in Inverness. We have Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick. We have Loch Aber Archives in Fort William and Skye and Loch Alsh Archive Centre in Portree. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, and High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But as I always say, and I'm very conscious that I do say the same words every week, but if you're able to donate towards our work, we're very grateful for that. There's a link to be able to do so in the text, both on Facebook and also if you're watching later on YouTube. So this week we are moving on to a new theme this month. We're moving on to crime and punishment. Always a lot of interest in this subject. Whenever we do a talk or an event around this, there's always a lot of interest. And we're starting by looking this week at witchcraft and witches, which of course for many years was a crime and something that has a lot of attention just now at this time of year, but also just now in the current climate. There's a lot of attention on this subject. It's a subject which has a lot of sensationalism behind it. It's often something that appears in films and so on. But it's something that also needs to be treated with compassion and empathy, because many women and also some men lost their lives as a result of witchcraft legislation in the past. Now, witchcraft had been a worry for centuries. It's mentioned in the Bible, mentioned in the book of Exodus, that thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. But you can see that yes, it was a concern, but also that really illustrates that it was an ecclesiastical issue. This concern about witches and witchcraft practice was something that was seen to be in the realm of the church. The church could deal with it. But it became a criminal offence in Scotland in 1563. But it is that piece of legislation coming into force is intrinsically linked with the establishment of the Protestant Church, and that link between religion and witchcraft continues. So I think in order to understand witchcraft, in order to start telling you about some of the stories in our collections, I think it's helpful to understand the context and the authority of the church at the time. So we need to start by looking at the Reformation. The Reformation started in Europe in the early 1500s, and the purpose of the Reformation was to move away from the Catholic Church and the practices of the Catholic Church. There were certain aspects of the Catholic faith at the time which were seen to be either idolatrous, so there was the statuary and so on in the churches was seen to be an issue, that there was an intermediate state, that people were worshipping the statue rather than worshipping God. And also there was a lot of issues around almost the commercialization of faith. People were able to pay for forgiveness, pay to go into heaven, and so on. And so the Reformation was a move away from that practice. And it was led in Europe by, amongst others, Martin Luther. And support travelled across Europe thanks to the recently invented printing press. And that is just, I think we forget what a huge turning point that was. Such an important turning point in human history, the development of the printing press and the way that changed communication of information. So by the mid-1500s, the Reformation movement had come to Scotland, and John Knox was a leading figure in Scotland. 1560 is a key date in Scottish history. This is the time that the Scottish Parliament rejected the Pope's authority and the Catholic practices. They were seeking not to start a new church entirely, but to reform the church. And this resulted eventually in 1592 with the establishment of the Church of Scotland. But one of the things that accompanied the Reformation in Scotland in 1560 was the creation in 1561 of the first Book of Discipline. This outlined prohibited behaviours, things that shouldn't be done, and we'll come back to this in a few weeks because we're looking specifically at Sabbath breaking and other breaches of discipline, and that will be a really interesting one. But this Book of Discipline, published in or created in 1561, was built upon in 1562 when the General Assembly of the Protestant Church met to look at, amongst other things, what they wanted put into law to further and protect the new Reformed Church. So this is where we see it going from being issues that are purely dealt with within the church to being passed into legislation. And they listed all sorts of things, from blasphemy to adultery, that would move from being a church remit to fix to becoming a legal thing. And witchcraft isn't specifically explicitly mentioned in there, but it can be implied as one of those areas that would be looked at. And so the Witchcraft Act, when it came in 1563, was one of a number of pieces of legislation passed around that time, and a Witchcraft Act had also been passed in England just a little bit earlier. Different wording, different detail, but it shows the momentum on the subject. So I want to start by reading the Scottish Witchcraft Act to you. Now, I'm aware that sounds absolutely terrible, that I'm going to read out an Act of Parliament, but it is incredibly short. So it reads like this. Item. Forasmuch as the Queen's Majesty and the three estates in this present Parliament are informed that the heavy and abominable superstition used by diverse lieges of this realm by the use of witchcraft, sorcery, and necromancy, and the credence given thereto in times bygone against the law of God, and for avoiding and putting away of all such vain superstition in time to come. So they're saying there's a lot of witchcraft and belief in witchcraft going on. There has been in the past, and we want to stop it in the future. It is statute and ordained by the Queen's Majesty and the three estates foresaid, that no manner of person or persons of whatsoever estate, degree, or condition, to take upon hand in any time hereafter to use any manner of witchcraft, sorcery, or necromancy. So you're not allowed to practice witchcraft, nor give themselves out to have any such craft or knowledge thereof, thereby abusing the people. So you're not allowed to claim that you have abilities in witchcraft, because then you'll be deceiving people. And also, it goes on to say that any person seeking help, response, or consultation from any such users or abusers foresaid of witchcraft, sorcery, or necromancy. So you're also not allowed to consult a witch. You're not allowed to go to a witch for help. Under the pain of death, which is said to be executed against the user and the abuser, as well as the seeker of the response or consultation. And then just a final sentence about the fact that the legal system has the authority to issue the death penalty. So, as I say, it's of course complex wording because it's legal, but it's very much a very, very short act. And what it does is it authorises a sentence of capital punishment for those who practice witchcraft, those who claim to be able to practice witchcraft, or those who consult with a witch. And that sentence of death was indeed passed on around 2,000 people that we know of. And it's interesting to note that Scotland's execution rate is around 4 times higher than the rest of Europe. Many of those accused underwent torture to enlist a confession. Often that was in the form of sleep deprivation. And if found guilty, and the strangest things constituted proof, but we'll come back to that shortly, they were usually strangled to death and then their bodies burnt. The purpose being that if the body was burnt, there could be nothing left to connect the devil to them. But yes, sometimes burnt to death, but often strangled and then burnt. And this momentum that we see in the country was further strengthened in 1591 when King James VI became personally involved. This extract that I'm going to read now is from our Margaret MacDougall collection, which I've spoken about with great passion before. It's a wonderful collection. But there are varying stories, but I'll read you her take on it. King James VI tolerated witches, and did not put too much credence on the many tales of witches which his people and advisers believed in so strongly. His attitudes changed, however, when he himself was affected by circumstances attributed to the ill will of witches. In 1589, Anne of Denmark, his future queen, set sail for Scotland, but heavy gales and winds delayed the vessel in which she was sailing, and after several days at sea was forced to return to Oslo. The unfavourable winds were said to have been brought about by the witches of Norway and Scotland. James hurried to Norway and was married there. Thereafter, the known witches of Norway were rounded up and burnt at the stake. On his return to Scotland, James became a persecutor of witches. He actually wrote an Act of Parliament in 1591, which was the most severe measure ever introduced against witches. They were rounded up and burned at the stake. The most notorious witch at this time was a Dr. Fian, who after considerable torture was burned to death. As I say, there are varying stories around that. Some say that it was his own ship that was battered, but the result in any case was his own personal great interest in the subject. He published pamphlets, he wrote a book, Demonology, about the subject, and he authorised executions, including the famous executions of the North Berwick witches. So given all that background information about where the legislation came from and why the momentum in the country was so strong, where can we then go to look in our collections to find references to witchcraft, necromancy and sorcery? Well, perhaps an obvious place to start is in our church collections. So Dingwall Presbytery minutes of 1650 record the case of Margaret Dow, who was accused of sorcery. It's a very short extract, and it says, Margaret Dow summoned for sorcery by burying a lamb under her threshold. She called, appeared, acknowledged the guilt alleged, affirming that she did it only in simplicity, by the information of a poor woman that came to her house, as a preventative against the death of the rest of her animals. The presbytery being the court above the kirk session in the church, they would deal with cases passed up to them. And that's a typical example of the sort of case that existed. In that instance, there's no malice, there's no kind of active malice against anybody else. That is someone attempting to prevent harm to their own livestock. They've already lost some, and they're doing whatever they can to try and prevent more livestock dying. And it's interesting to note that when that was written in 1650, by then it had already been a criminal offence for nearly 100 years, but it's still the church who are dealing with it in the first instance. Another example of the church responding to an accusation of witchcraft is the story of Elspeth Buie, or Elspeth Bay, and that can be found in our Golspie Kirk session minutes of November 1732. And Elspeth's motive is different again. And this is what the extract in Golspie Kirk session says. At a meeting of the Kirk session of Golspie on the 21st of November 1732, it was reported to the session that Elspeth Buie, alias Ross, in Kilmally, having a child that was seized with a convulsion fit, in order to cure the child, digged a hole in the ground and put therein a living cockerel in the manner of some sacrifice. And the said Elspeth, being cited to this deed and appearing, was interrogated concerning the fact laid to her charge, and she answered that she confessed she did put a living fowl under the ground, having seen it a practicable custom amongst some of the vulgar to use such a means in order to remove convulsion fits from persons seized. The session, finding it necessary to expose publicly the heinousness of such wicked practice, which in effect they concluded to be gross idolatry or sacrifice to the devil, and the council, the said Elspeth, was apprehended guilty thereof, and others who might have been guilty and not discovered. So they're basically holding her up as an example. They did appoint the said Elspeth to appear before the congregation to confess and be reprehended for her uncommon crime, but she refused, and was therefore charged apud acta, as you'll know, my fluent Latin is not great, to appear before the next diet of presbytery. It then goes on slightly later to say that at a meeting of the Kirk session on the 23rd of April 1733, so some months later, Elspeth Buie, having stood in sackcloth for 5 days, and being sharply rebuked for her uncommon crime, and seriously exhorted to repentance, was absolved in the usual manner. And I think you get a sense from that, again, there's no malice there, you get a sense of maybe a little bit of desperation. This is someone who has a child who is suffering from convulsions. She doesn't know what to do, and someone has said, if you bury a live cockerel under your porch, that will cure her. And so I think it looks like she's doing that out of desperation. And there does seem to be a variation in the outcome depending on the motive. So those two that we've seen there, there's no malice there. There's nothing intended to harm anybody else. And you'll see from what I've mentioned so far, and probably from your own mental picture, that witches are often women. Not always, but often. And the reason for that, or one of the reasons for that, is that they were seen to be vulnerable to the devil's temptation. They were on the fringes, and also they were often those who practiced traditional healing, although there are men in that category as well. And Neil Beaton is an example of that, a long line of traditional healers who was often suspected of witchcraft, and that appears in our Mary Beath papers. But I'm scheduling in a talk on Mary Beath next year, so we'll come back to that. So there are references to witchcraft as well as in our church collections, also in our privately deposited collections. And my lovely colleague Belinda in Nucleus shared with me some extracts from Folklore and Gleanings and Character Sketches from the Far North by Reverend George Sutherland. And there are numerous Caithness examples within that, but I've picked two in particular to tell you about, a woman and a man. So we're starting with Bella Brims. It says that Bella Brims held power over not only domestic animals but also whales in the sea. When a young maid was struggling to get enough butter out of the churn, Belle offered to help at no cost to the neighbours. The maid agreed, and when the butter came it was in such great quantities that the churn could barely hold it, but it did taste somewhat fishy. Belle confessed to the maid that she took it from a female whale that she saw out at sea. She dressed unconventionally in an old linen coif, a tartan plaid fastened with a silver brooch, a red petticoat and white woollen stockings, while in her hand she carried a stout walking stick. Belle had friends in Orkney, weird sisters we may be sure, and when she wished to pay them a visit or attend a coven in Orkney, she commandeered a crab, and by some satanic device managed to seat herself comfortably on the crustacean's back, and in this way was ferried across the Pentland Firth. She is reported to have cursed Rob Campbell, who was captain of a boat that went between Thurso and Tongue and caused a great storm to wreck his ship. The curse involved filling a tub with water to represent the sea, and then placing a wooden bowl afloat in it to represent the boat. Finally, she put water into an earthenware jar and corked the jar tightly, placing it beside a blazing fire to heat. After doing this, she started reciting the needed incantations and would slowly release the cork from the jar next to the fire, causing the water in the tub to churn, and she continued until the tub was bubbling violently and the wooden bowl overturned. And in our Hetty Munro collection, which I've spoken about in the past, there's a similar story about the Witch of Duncansby. Very similar, but the witch in that one is called Meg Watt, and it was a Malcolm Grote who was cursed and drowned. She describes Meg as being unattractive in appearance and demeanour, and explains her visits to Orkney, saying that she turned herself into a small crab and rode on the back of a bigger crab. She also says that she turned herself into a black cat. So that's perhaps a sort of traditional image you might have in your head of a witch. There's also, from our Nucleus collections, Donald Dewell Mackay, a notable wizard who trained in Italy, it is said under no less a distinguished professor than Satan himself. The fee for attending this school was that the last person to leave would be claimed by the devil. Donald was last to leave, but when the devil tried to claim his prize, he insisted he wasn't last, but that his shadow was. Satan seized the shadow, and Donald made his escape to be shadowless ever after. He is credited with meeting the fairy queen in Smoo Cave in Durness, and in so doing having a box containing fairies or imps. These beings would do his bidding and were ever willing to work. Credited with helping to bring cornfields at a farm in Leithmore as well as in Ray, and for attempting to build a bridge across the Pentland Firth made from the sands of Dunnet Beach. Also one day out the front of Ray Church with Satan himself, trying to convince the congregation not to go inside, but to come and join the devil instead. So all sorts of information in there. But one of the things you see across that is that references to transforming into an animal, common theme that we see across records to do with witches, and also that ability to control people or nature. Now, our Margaret McDougall collection also contains a document that details the common practices of the things that witches would do, and it includes things like the ability to turn into animals, the ability to seize control over things, but it also records ways of identifying them. So I wanted to first of all read you a little extract which I particularly enjoy about witches' travel. So it says here, witches are reported to have used broomsticks to get from place to place, but in the Highlands, however, it was believed that they could turn empty eggshells into boats to cross rivers, lochs and oceans. The old Highlanders always thrust an egg spoon through the eggshell to prevent it being used by witches. Please do tell me if any of you still do that. But she also goes on to talk about the ways that witches were identified. So often witches were accused by neighbours, that very horrible and insidious thing of neighbours talking and watching and spreading rumours and reporting back. And once they were accused, there were various ways of testing whether they were indeed a witch. And so Margaret McDougall includes these. Many methods were used to discover witches. Men who claimed to have the authority of detecting them were employed by authorities and individuals to seek witches out. These men, known as prickers or witch prickers, roamed the countryside and by tricks and subterfuge discovered, and she's got it in quotation marks, hundreds of witches who were then put to death. That the great majority of these people so discovered were innocent was of little account in these days of witch hunting. The pricker discovered his victim by stripping him or her naked. He then searched the body for the devil's mark, which was considered a sure sign that the devil had been given possession of the person's soul. And given that they would take anything from birthmarks to freckles to bruises, you can imagine if they were looking for a mark on a body, they would probably find one. So he would search the body for the devil's mark. A pin was then thrust into the mark, and the victim asked to withdraw it. The confusion and torture of the poor soul usually made them incapable of finding the pinhead. Failure to withdraw the pin without feeling pain was seen as ample proof of guilt. Sometimes the wound didn't bleed, and this also was considered a sign of guilt. A famous witch pricker, Mr. Patterson, visited the Highlands in the 17th century, and as a result of his visit, hundreds of witches were burned at the stake. His brutal methods of discovery and his personal cruelty to his victims finally became too much even for the witch baiters. It was finally discovered that Patterson was a woman masquerading as a man. And the Mr. Patterson referred to there is the infamous Christian Cadell, who was responsible for numerous deaths of witches. And it's interesting to note that I believe witch prickers were paid for each witch that they discovered. And so it's believed that some of them would use needles that had a retractable point, so that if it looked like you were pushing them in, but it would leave no mark, and therefore the witch pricker would get commission and the person would be taken to trial. Another collection that has references to witchcraft and people convicted of witchcraft is D1033, the Angus McKechnie Antiquarian Papers collection, a fabulous collection, one of my favourites. Really diverse, covers hundreds of years and dozens of subjects. There's all sorts in the McKechnie collection. And it includes a document relating to the case of Lachlan and George Rattray. The document is dated 1705, and it's a summary by the Commissioners of Justiciary, one of those words I always get wrong, you'll be used to that by now, like statistical accounts. Commissioners of Justiciary to George and Lachlan Rattrays to answer for the crimes of charming by witchcraft and malefice sorcery or necromancy. In October or November, round about there, 1704, they were arrested and put into Inverness Tolbooth. There's very little specific information about what they had done, but there are references to many malefices, which are evil spells or enchantments, as well as charming, which was control by magic, and necromancy, which is the practice of magic or black magic involving communication with the dead. They were held in the Tolbooth until the 27th of February 1705, when they were summoned to answer for their crimes. And the trial was held on the 25th of June 1706, and they were found guilty and sentenced to death in the July. Now, interesting there, that difference of sentence. So we've seen so far people being rebuked, people being told off, stand in sackcloth and so on. But this is somebody, or the two men, who are being sentenced to death. And I think perhaps, and I'm no expert on this, but perhaps that's equating to the seriousness of the intent of why they were doing something. However, the execution, there was a reprieve given, so the two were not executed, and their sentence was finally commuted to banishment in December 1706. So yes, fortunate not to lose their lives, but still a heavy punishment to be banished from the country. We can of course find references to witches in the landscape, so I'm sure some of you, and I'm sure you'll let me know, you will know a witch's hill or a witch's stone or so on. And perhaps one of the most famous in the Highlands is the stone in Littletown in Dornoch, which marks the site of the last legal witchcraft execution in Britain, which was the execution of Janet Horne. And more about Janet Horne can be found on the National Library of Scotland website, and I'm going to read this to you now. I think it is a particularly incredibly sad story. Janet Horne was the last person in Britain to be tried and executed for witchcraft. In 1727, she and her daughter were arrested and jailed in Dornoch. Janet's daughter suffered from a deformity in her hands and feet. Neighbours gossiped that she looked as though she had hooves, and Janet was accused of turning her daughter into a pony to transport her around the countryside to carry out her witchcraft. It was believed that the hooves were proof of their witchcraft, and that they remained in place in the hands and feet because Janet had failed to completely return her daughter from pony to human form. Janet's legal options were very limited, and her trial was rushed through. Captain David Ross, the Sheriff Depute of Sutherland, found both Janet and her daughter guilty and ordered that they should be burned to death the following day. Her daughter managed to escape, but Janet, showing signs perhaps of what would be recognised today as dementia, was clearly confused by the events. She was tarred and feathered and paraded through Dornoch in a barrel. When she arrived at her execution place, Janet is said to have smiled and warmed herself at the very fire which was about to consume her. The stone that marks the site of Janet Horne's burning can still be seen in Littletown, although the date on the stone, 1722, is wrong, and it should read 1727. 9 years after her death, the Witchcraft Acts were repealed in Scotland and England, and it became unlawful to execute anyone for alleged witchcraft. Just an incredibly sad story, I think, there. And Margaret McDougall collection also refers to Janet Horne, and it says that one of the things given as proof of her guilt was that when she was asked to recite the Lord's Prayer, she stumbled and said that "Our Father who wert in heaven," rather than "Our Father who art in heaven," and they took that as evidence that she didn't believe that God was in heaven. Now, as that extract says, Janet Horne was the last person to be legally executed for witchcraft in Britain. In 1736, the Witchcraft Act was repealed. The Act was put in place in 1735, and then there was an amendment made in 36. And this coincided again, as the passing of the Witchcraft Act had, this repealing of the Witchcraft Act coincided with the changing nature of Scotland. This was the start of the Scottish Enlightenment. This was a huge increased focus on science, on intellectual thinking. And by this point, there were far fewer executions happening, and that is how the Act came to be repealed. And the crime of witchcraft was abolished, and instead the crime became pretended witchcraft. And instead of carrying a death sentence, it carried a maximum 1 year prison sentence, a huge drop in punishment. And to me, that looks like a change from the fear of what witches could do to an awareness of the damage that pretending to be a witch could do to someone trying to consult them. So the thought that people might be taken advantage of by someone pretending to be a witch, that's the fear, rather than the fear of the witches themselves and what they could do. But to finish off, we do have evidence in our collections that although the law had changed, there were still examples and cases of individuals persecuting others in the belief that they were witches. And you may have heard my colleague Catherine from Skye speaking about this on the Witches of Scotland podcast, or maybe read the article in the Scotsman about this. In our High Court and Sheriff Court papers, there are documents relating not to the prosecution of a witch, but to the prosecution of a man who tortured and murdered someone he suspected of being a witch. So it is him standing trial for his actions, not her. The High Court document is entitled Extract Petition and Information of HM Advocate against Rory MacDonald, Skye, for torturing and murdering Catherine McKinnon as a witch, and warrant for his arrest, dated 1754, so some 20 years after that act had been repealed. By looking at this High Court document and the related Sheriff Court papers, we can see that Rory MacDonald was held in first the garrison in Fort William and then in Inverness Tolbooth. And one of the court papers describes the crime he was accused of in this way: that sometime between January and May 1747, and probably about March, Catherine McKinnon, a poor beggar woman, went begging at the house of Rory MacDonald, who was a tacksman at Camas Cross, Isle of Skye. He was a prominent figure, and he was a tacksman, which means he was the sort of the level in between the landowner. He would rent land from the landowner and then he would rent it to tenants. So a high profile, prominent figure and a tacksman for the clan MacDonald of Armadale. And this is part of the extract of his document. It says that when Catherine McKinnon arrived at his door begging, he, upon pretence that she was a witch and had been concerned in poisoning some of his acquaintances, ordered her to be fast bound with ropes and the soles of her feet to be placed before a great fire, in order to extort a confession from her, which was done accordingly. And the poor woman so miserably tortured that she lost some of the toes in her feet, and she died about 14 days thereafter of the cruelties which had been exercised against her by the said Rory MacDonald, or by his orders, within his own dwelling house. And the petitioner, the person who's writing this document, says that he intends to bring Rory MacDonald to trial for this barbarous and cruel murder. And the documents record that Rory MacDonald forced his servants to do the tying, to tie her arms behind her back and to hold her feet against the kitchen fire. He threatened to harm his servants if they didn't obey him. And when Catherine was finally released, she crawled or somehow made her way to a neighbouring property and died there of her injuries about 2 weeks later. And as I say, interesting that she is not the one getting any blame here for practising witchcraft, if indeed she did. The blame here is being laid on Rory MacDonald for his treatment of her. Rory MacDonald denied the allegations. He said that the information was false and malicious, but there are other documents in this bundle that maybe shed a little bit of light on Rory MacDonald's character. It says that he is reputed by the general voice of the country, so generally everybody thinks that he's a very quarrelsome and mischievous person. There are also papers that accuse him of wearing Highland dress, which of course was a crime at the time, and carrying guns, swords, pistols, dirks, and other warlike weapons. And also, when instructed to give those weapons up, as was the case after Culloden, he was said to have concealed 4 guns, 2 swords, a pistol, and a dirk rather than give them up. He's also accused of taking part in riots, acts of violence, and threats to destroy and kill several other people. So, of course, I wasn't there, so I can't possibly give an opinion, but we get a sense, perhaps, of the type of personality he was. There are various documents relating to this case, but there is no definitive answer about whether he was convicted or not in the end. Now, as I mentioned, the 1563 Witchcraft Act was repealed in 1735-36, and that legislation stood until it was in turn repealed by the Fraudulent Mediums Act of 1951. If you are interested in finding out more about this subject and the current discussion that's happening about how to mark or commemorate or acknowledge what happened, that there's a lot of current debate around that, then I would recommend you have a look at the Edinburgh University's survey of Scottish witchcraft that has an interactive map and database that you can look across the country, and also the Witches of Scotland podcast, which, as I mentioned, my colleague Catherine spoke on a wee while ago. I hope you enjoyed that one. I hope you can join me next week. Next week I will be carrying on Crime and Punishment, looking at police records. It will be pre-recorded next week because I am taking part in an event with our adult learning colleagues. So it will be pre-recorded, but someone will be there to reply, and I'll certainly pick up any comments afterwards. The other thing is it will go out at 11:02 because it will be the 11th, and I wanted to leave those 2 minutes for the 2-minute silence on the 11th, so it will go out slightly later. Also, to let you know that next Thursday on the at 3 p.m. we'll be putting out a talk on our Lochaber Facebook page, a very short talk about Lochaber in the Second World War, and that'll be my colleague Peter doing that, so please do have a look at that as well. But for now, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, that High Life Highland's a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription to take part in the Learn with Lorna talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work and enable us to continue sharing these stories, then please do so. We're very, very grateful for that. And I'll speak to you next week. Thank you.